I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The ruling landed with the force of a constitutional earthquake. In this fictionalized royal drama, the Supreme Court had confirmed that documents carrying the authority of the crown had been unlawfully altered, and the judgment placed Camilla at the center of the scandal. She did not argue. She did not leave. She simply froze as the words were read, while William, standing only feet away, struggled to contain a fury years in the making. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla gripped the arm of her chair as the final paragraph was read aloud. The Supreme Court, Britain's highest court for constitutional disputes, had reached a devastating conclusion. Crown documents had been forged, and alterations were tied directly to papers connected with her office. These were not harmless pages. They dealt with royal property, private authority, succession-related instructions, and sealed decisions that depended on authentic signatures to carry legitimate weight. William placed both hands on the table. He did not shout. That restraint made his anger feel more dangerous. The prince demanded to know how anyone inside the family could allow the crown's authority to be changed on paper and then treated as genuine. Camilla looked toward him, fear replacing disbelief, but she offered no answer. She knew the problem was larger than embarrassment. If false documents had shaped real decisions, then every privilege or instruction built upon them could now be questioned. Charles listened until one passage stopped him cold. The king recognized wording almost identical to a private directive he remembered discussing years earlier, yet he was certain he had never signed the version now sitting before them. A crown directive is simply a formal written instruction carrying royal authority, and that distinction mattered because copied language could make a false document appear convincing. He asked for the original palace archive file. Then another detail surfaced. The judgment referred to a second sealed bundle, containing papers investigators believed had borrowed phrases from genuine royal instructions. William's expression hardened. Someone had not merely changed a sentence. Someone appeared to have understood how authentic palace language worked. An aide finally delivered the detail that changed the room again. The investigation had not begun with the court. Months earlier, someone inside the royal household had noticed the conflicting records and secretly preserved the first piece of evidence before it disappeared from the internal system. Camilla stared toward the closed file. Charles said nothing. William immediately asked for the name. The judgment had exposed the scandal, but it had not yet revealed the betrayal that made the scandal possible. A court ruling could identify signatures, dates, and altered pages. It could not measure what happened inside the family when those pages became personal. For Camilla, the danger was humiliation. For Charles, it was the possibility that trust inside his own household had collapsed. For William, it was something deeper, the fear that the institution he would one day inherit had been manipulated from within, while everyone continued smiling. Camilla had spent years building influence beside Charles, learning how palace decisions moved and how quickly access could become power. The queen consort, the king's wife who supports the monarch but does not rule in her own right, now faced more than embarrassment. If the judgment destroyed trust in her role, everything she had built inside the household could collapse with it. William saw the danger differently. As heir, the person first in line to inherit the throne, he treated royal documents as instruments of real authority, not ceremonial paper. They could shape property, access, privilege, and decisions that might survive for decades. He knew that if one false record could pass as genuine, then the credibility of every future instruction could be questioned. Charles read the ruling alone, before calling his son into the room. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the file, and stayed silent long enough to make William uneasy. Then the king touched one paragraph and admitted that the wording sounded disturbingly familiar. He remembered discussing something close to it years earlier. but not approving the version now under scrutiny. William leaned closer. His anger sharpened. Camilla confronted Charles later without aides present. She reminded him how many papers crossed her desk with little explanation and insisted that not every signature, amendment, or instruction had been hers to examine closely. He did not accuse her. He did something worse. He refused to reassure her. She asked whether he believed her, and the monarch answered only that he believed the documents had to speak first. Then William received the forensic notes. 2 handwritten corrections appeared in different inks, suggesting the disputed wording had been assembled in stages instead of drafted through one clean process. An archived correspondence log deepened the mystery. One document had entered the royal household on a date when the official responsible for approving it was outside the country. William stopped reading. He looked at Charles and asked the question nobody wanted to answer. Who first noticed the dates did not match? The response pointed back to Windsor, to a meeting once dismissed as routine. And suddenly the scandal was no longer beginning in a courtroom. It was beginning months earlier, with one uncomfortable conversation behind a closed Windsor door. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks harmless, until history turns around and points directly at it. In this fictional account, that moment came during a private Windsor administrative meeting, months before the judgment. William had expected a routine discussion about estate authority. Instead, a senior clerk placed 2 versions of the same crown instruction in front of him, and quietly told the prince that both carried the same approval, but only one existed in the official register. William studied the pages twice before speaking. A crown authorization is a formal written approval that gives a royal decision official force, and the difference between these 2 versions was impossible to dismiss. One was properly registered. The other carried broader authority over protected royal property, a different date, and a signature presented as genuine even though no matching entry existed in the palace record. He assumed at first that someone had made a clerical mistake. The clerk changed everything with one sentence. He told William that the irregular version had already been used to justify a real palace decision, involving access to restricted property. The prince stopped treating the papers like an administrative puzzle. If false authority had produced a real consequence, then the problem was no longer paperwork. Someone had acted on it, and someone else had allowed that action to stand. Camilla stiffened when William raised the matter privately later that evening. He asked whether she had ever seen the altered language before it was used. The Queen Consort replied that countless administrative papers moved through different offices, and that she could not be expected to remember every amendment. He pressed once more. She ended the conversation abruptly, leaving him with an answer that sounded less like reassurance and more like distance. Then the danger deepened. The clerk had quietly saved a scanned copy before the disputed version vanished from the internal digital archive 2 days after their meeting. That preserved file later gave investigators something the deleted record could not hide. Phrases had been lifted from an authentic directive signed years earlier, making the altered document convincing enough to escape casual scrutiny. William finally understood why that Windsor meeting mattered. It was the moment a small inconsistency became evidence of deliberate construction. Later, when he learned who had authorized the disputed document to be used after questions had already been raised, his restraint disappeared. The trail no longer pointed toward a faceless office. It pointed toward someone close enough to understand what those papers could change. The evidence had moved from paper to people, and William was about to confront the one person whose answer could either save the family or tear it apart. There were no officials between them. No private secretary, no legal advisor. Just William, Camilla, and a document laid flat on the table, like an accusation neither could escape. He did not begin with ceremony. He pointed to the disputed signature and asked one question. "Tell me you didn't do this." For several seconds she stared back at him, motionless. Then she pushed the paper away. and the confrontation became painfully personal. William had arranged the meeting immediately after reviewing the Supreme Court findings, refusing to let aides soften the language or lawyers control the exchange. He brought three things with him: the original registered document, the altered version, and the court's forensic comparison. A forensic comparison is a detailed examination of writing, digital records, dates, and document changes used to determine how a file was created or altered. He wanted no room left for vague explanations. Camilla accused William of deciding her guilt before he ever entered the room. She told the prince that his silence, his posture, even the way he had placed the papers before her made his judgment obvious. He answered that he had come hoping she could explain evidence he no longer knew how to dismiss. The queen consort looked away, then asked whether he had ever considered how many decisions were made under pressure around Charles. Camilla rose from her chair. She told him he had never understood the compromises required to protect the monarchy when private disputes, public expectations, and royal duties collided at once. William stood as well. He did not raise his voice. Protecting the crown, he said, could never mean rewriting its authority. The words landed harder because he delivered them without anger spilling over. Then Camilla made the admission he had been waiting for. She acknowledged that she knew changes had been made to at least one document, but insisted those amendments had been presented to her as administratively necessary. She said she had never been told the changes were improper. William immediately opened the court analysis. The prince pointed to the digital metadata. Metadata is hidden information attached to a computer file showing details such as when it was edited and what device handled it. The revised draft had been linked to a device assigned to Camilla's private office. Her explanation suddenly carried a far heavier burden. Charles entered before either could speak again. The king looked at the papers, then at them both, and said quietly that this was no longer theirs to settle privately. William wanted truth. Camilla wanted survival. But Charles now understood that the crown itself had become the judge inside the family. Charles had spent much of the crisis trapped between two identities, husband and monarch. Now those identities collided. He entered the room carrying no speech and offering no comfort. Instead, he picked up the disputed file, read the first page slowly, and told Camilla that every royal privilege connected to the documents would be suspended until the judgment had been fully acted upon. William watched his father make the decision and understood what it was costing him. Charles knew the court had already settled the legal question in this fictional drama, but the palace still had choices to make. The Supreme Court determines legal findings, while the monarch controls many internal household matters such as access, ceremonial duties, and private royal arrangements. Palace legal officers had warned him that every decision touched by forged documentation had to be reviewed from the beginning, no matter who had benefited. Camilla stared at him as the meaning settled in. She asked whether their marriage now counted for nothing inside the palace. The queen consort's voice stayed controlled, but the hurt beneath it was clear. Charles answered that marriage could not erase consequences. He told her he would not use his position to shield her from a ruling that had already damaged trust in the crown. William watched the exchange without interrupting. The prince had entered the room furious, certain that action was overdue. Yet as he looked at his father, he saw something anger had hidden from him: grief. Charles was not simply disciplining a member of the household. He was drawing a line through his own marriage, choosing institutional duty over personal protection. For the first time, William's fury loosened enough to make room for pity. Charles then ordered temporary restrictions on several royal archives and demanded a full audit of every decision connected to the disputed papers. A royal archive is the protected collection where official and private records are preserved for future reference. The review mattered because one false authorization could have created privileges that never lawfully existed. The first result was worse than expected. An altered authorization had affected who could enter a historically protected royal property, meaning The forged wording had already changed a real boundary inside the monarchy. William immediately understood the danger. If access had been granted or denied on false authority, every related decision would now have to be unwound. Charles signed the suspension order, placed the pen down, and looked toward his son. He told William that the household would begin reversing every decision built on the false paperwork the next morning. The scandal had finally produced consequences, and by sunrise, those consequences would no longer remain hidden behind palace walls. The next morning did not begin with shouting. It began with cancellations. Names disappeared from schedules. Access permissions were suspended. Meetings were removed. Rooms once opened automatically now required new authorization. The machinery of the monarchy was quietly reversing decisions connected to the disputed documents. And for Camilla, the reality became undeniable when a senior household official approached her before a scheduled engagement and told her, gently but firmly, that she would not be attending. Camilla stood still for a moment, then removed her gloves slowly and said she understood. The queen consort had arrived prepared to fulfill a formal engagement, but the decision had already been made. In this fictional drama, palace administrators were reviewing every action linked to the forged papers, separating legitimate decisions from those created through invalid authority. That mattered because a false approval could turn an ordinary privilege into something the crown had never lawfully granted. Charles saw her moments later and almost crossed the room. The king stopped before taking the final step. Their eyes met, and neither spoke. What had begun as a legal crisis was now cutting directly through their marriage. She had lost access to parts of her public role, while he had become the person enforcing that loss. He looked away first, and the silence hurt more than an argument would have. William received a heavier briefing before midday. Legal teams had begun correcting affected records, while several internal privileges remained frozen. A royal household privilege is simply an access, role, or permission granted inside the monarchy, and the review showed that more decisions had been influenced by the disputed documents than anyone first believed. At least one of those decisions involved members of the younger royal generation. The prince read that sentence twice. For William, that discovery made the threat deeply personal. If decisions touching the younger royals had been shaped by false authority, then the damage had reached his family's future. Then another file changed the direction of the investigation. A previously sealed note, written by a late royal advisor, recorded concerns about the disputed authority months before William had ever seen the Windsor papers. The documented account stated that questions had been raised privately, then left unresolved. That meant the warning signs had existed long before the crisis reached the court. William took the note directly to Charles. He expected another discussion about legal strategy, damaged records, and who had known what. Instead, the monarch closed the file and asked his son to walk with him alone. William hesitated, then followed. After days of courts, files, and accusations, father and son were finally about to speak, without the institution standing between them. For the first time since the crisis began, Charles and William spoke without lawyers, courtiers, or documents between them. The king looked older than he had days earlier. William looked less angry, but not less determined. Charles admitted that his greatest fear was no longer scandal. It was inheritance, not money or property, but the burden he might leave behind for his son. William listened, then answered with a promise that changed the emotional direction of everything. Charles had asked for privacy because the crisis had moved beyond blame. The monarch now had to decide what rules would govern the institution after the damage was exposed. In this fictional drama, a royal protocol is simply an internal set of procedures designed to control how important decisions are approved and recorded. He admitted that too much had depended on personal trust, and not enough on strict verification. That weakness had allowed questionable papers to gain authority they should never have carried. Charles then said what he had avoided for days. He felt responsible. The king told William that warning signs had existed, questions had been raised, and still the system had failed to stop the disputed documents before they affected real decisions. William did not excuse what happened, but he refused to let his father carry every failure alone. Responsibility, the prince said, was not the same as guilt. For the first time since the judgment, the tension between them softened. William finally explained his own anger. He had not been furious only because rules were broken. He had been afraid. The future king worried that one hidden compromise could destroy trust in everything his children might someday inherit. The titles, responsibilities, and public faith surrounding the crown. Charles listened without interrupting, and when his son finished, he understood that the fury had always been rooted in protection. Then Charles revealed the decision. He would not simply suspend the arrangements created through the forged papers. Every privilege derived from them would be permanently revoked. The king also asked William to oversee a new system, requiring 2 independent checks before sensitive crown authorizations could take effect. Dual verification meant that no single office or person could quietly give questionable paperwork the force of royal authority. William accepted. The prince promised that rebuilding trust would matter more than protecting appearances, even when transparency hurt the family. Charles nodded, knowing that his son was already carrying part of the future. Their private reconciliation created a path forward, but beyond the palace walls, the judgment had already exploded across Britain's front pages. Inside the palace, the family had finally chosen accountability. Outside its gates, the country was preparing its own verdict. By morning, the scandal no longer belonged to the palace. It belonged to the country. Commuters unfolded newspapers, dominated by the same royal face. Broadcasters abandoned ordinary schedules. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd began forming beneath the gates as cameras turned toward every arriving car. But one image captured the national mood more powerfully than any headline. A newspaper held above the crowd with a single word stretched across its front page: forged. William watched the coverage for less than a minute before switching it off. The prince hated seeing private pain turned into public spectacle, but he also knew silence would now look like evasion. Broadcasters were framing the fictional judgment as a crisis of royal trust, not merely a family argument. That distinction mattered, because the crown depends on public confidence, and forged authority could damage belief in every legitimate decision that followed. Camilla reacted differently. The queen consort saw the front pages being carried into the palace and asked that they be removed. She could endure legal language more easily than public judgment. Minutes later, she changed her mind and requested one copy. The single word across the page forced her to confront what the country now associated with her name, and she sat with it instead of sending it away. Charles approved a short palace statement confirming that every arrangement touched by the invalid documents had been reviewed and corrective measures were already underway. A palace statement is an official public message issued on behalf of the royal household, usually designed to clarify its position without revealing private discussions. The king insisted that this one avoid excuses. If trust was going to be rebuilt, he believed the response had to show action rather than defensiveness. Then the public mood began to shift. One broadcaster emphasized Charles's decision to revoke privileges created through the disputed papers, instead of quietly preserving them. The king's choice did not erase the scandal, but it changed the question. People were no longer asking only how the crisis happened. They were beginning to ask whether the monarchy was willing to correct itself. Outside Buckingham Palace, the strongest reaction came when confirmation spread that stricter authentication procedures would permanently replace the old system. The crowd did not suddenly become united, but the announcement gave the crisis a direction. William understood that accountability had finally become visible. Charles knew one decision still remained. The monarch had dealt with invalid privileges, damaged records, and public confidence. Now he had to settle what the scandal would mean inside his own family. The court had delivered the legal judgment. Britain had delivered the public judgment. And now the royal family faced the only verdict still remaining: what they would become after the damage was done. The final decision was not announced with triumph. There was no celebration inside the palace, because nobody had truly won. In this fictionalized drama, Camilla lost the privileges tied to the forged documents. Charles lost trust he could never simply restore. And William lost the illusion that the monarchy could survive on tradition alone. Yet from that damage came something harder and lasting. A decision that the crown would protect itself through truth, even when truth wounded the family. Charles formally revoked every royal arrangement proven to depend on the forged papers. The king made clear that none would return through private discretion. A permanent verification system was established for sensitive crown records, meaning royal documents would require independent archive checks and more than one authorized signature before taking effect. The change mattered because trust could no longer rest on one office, one relationship, or one unchecked piece of paper. Charles then met Camilla privately for one final conversation about the crisis. He did not shout, and she did not defend herself with anger. The monarch told her that affection could not erase consequences, and that her place inside royal decision-making had permanently changed. The queen consort listened in silence, before accepting what the ruling and palace response had made unavoidable. Their marriage remained personal, but authority would no longer move through the same doors. William entered his father's study later, expecting another difficult exchange. Instead, Charles told him that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant allowing it to expose its own failures. The prince let some of his anger fall away. He understood that legitimacy could not depend on personalities, secrecy, or family loyalty. It had to depend on rules strong enough to apply even when the person affected stood closest to the throne. The altered documents were formally invalidated. Decisions built upon them were reversed, and the internal authority that had allowed questionable paperwork to gain force was dismantled. William emerged with greater responsibility, but also with a clearer idea of the crown he might inherit. Camilla's frozen reaction stood as the symbol of the moment. Personal influence collided with institutional limits. Charles paid the emotional cost of choosing duty over protection. William turned fury into resolve. Camilla faced consequences that could not be quietly undone. The monarchy survived not because the scandal vanished, but because it finally refused to hide from what had happened. There was nowhere else for the story to go. The forged authority was gone, the consequences were permanent, and the crown emerged wounded but unmistakably changed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.